As somebody who came of age in the 60s, the fight was always against the bureaucrats, whether they were in big business at GM or at the Pentagon or on college campuses. Are the bureaucrats self-multiplying or like nobody likes bureaucrats, right? So why do we keep getting more of them?
Well, they are self-multiplying in the sense that they're constantly telling the system, whoever is doing the hiring or allocating the funds, that they need more people in order to perform the function. On the other hand, they partly establish what the function is. So we have an overlord society, and in order to carry out the task of enforcing these laws, you need an increasing number of bureaucrats. Mm-hmm. And in the colleges, it's gotten especially bad. You've got many colleges that do not have the money to hire faculty members who are on tenure track, so they hire adjuncts who are paid very small amounts of money. You can get somebody paid $3,000 to teach a semester course, and so the students are not being taught by seasoned, experienced, tenured or tenured track professors. They're being taught by part-time adjuncts who, during the day, or at night, have other jobs.
And the cause of that is
the cause of that is that so much of the money is sucked up in order to support an ever-growing bureaucracy. The student life bureaucracy is just monumental.
Are you optimistic that we're going to be paring back some of the overcriminalization or the mass statutization of American life?
I think that we are on the verge of a massive reaction against overweening federal power. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean because people have become libertarians or people have become federalists. I think it's much more unideological of that. Guess what? People have become targets. People have become defendants. Everybody knows somebody who was prosecuted for something that either shouldn't have been a crime or they didn't intend to do anything criminal. And everybody knows somebody, or everybody has somebody in their family. And as more and more victims of an out-of-control system pile up, they are starting to wake up about. That's why there's a movement now to effectuate mens rea reform. Mm-hmm. Too many stories are now being told in the newspapers about somebody who got up in the morning, didn't intend to commit a crime, did something, and ended up with a prison sentence.
What are the hinge points? What are the key things that have to happen to make sure that this urge towards de-bureaucratizing our lives and de-lawyering our lives actually hits home?
So many people now have been hurt by the system, and including, and this is critical, members of Congress, members of state legislators, governors who have been indicted. They just argued former Virginia Governor McDonnell's case in the Supreme Court.
I come before you this evening as someone who has been falsely and wrongfully accused and whose public service has been wrongfully attacked. Earlier today, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against me and my wife, Maureen, alleging that we violated federal law by accepting gifts and loans.
And the lawyers for Virginia were obviously quite taken aback. They were getting hostile questions from all but one. I think they were in total shock. Why is that the case? There were amici briefs filed by an enormous number of former attorneys general, state attorneys general, a few federal attorneys general, former governors, all ganged together. People who wouldn't agree on what day of the week this is agreed that the Department of Justice was becoming almost a terrorist organization with respect to state, local, and even federal public officials. That's what causes change. The people in power begin to get hurt by their own system.
Let's talk about free speech. Particularly on college campuses, you co-founded the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. You also co-authored The Shadow University with Alan Kors. Talk about when you started FIRE, how bad things were, And then are they better or worse in the intervening years?
When I co-founded FIRE with Alan Kors, I assumed that FIRE would have about a 10-year life. We were not looking to start an institution. I thought that it was needed in order to deal with a temporary public panic and insanity. Suddenly the mid-'80s speech codes on academic campuses, on campuses that were liberal arts campuses, speech codes, certain things you couldn't talk about, kangaroo courts to enforce the speech codes. I figured there was such dissonance that presented by these institutions growing up on the campuses, that if we did a little pushback, just a little pushback, this edifice would collapse of its own idiocy and inappropriateness. Inappropriateness is a very important word, because you're talking here about liberal arts colleges where free speech and free ideas are supposed to be paramount. And so I figured 10 years and then we would go out of business. Little did I realize that things were going to be getting worse during those 10 years.
Talk about an early case, that helped push you to create FIRE, and then talk about how nowadays that wouldn't, it almost wouldn't even register.
Well, I'll tell you what got us to start FIRE was the publication of The Shadow University. It came out in '98, and suddenly Kors and I were getting phone calls and panic letters from people on college campuses who were in trouble for doing things that no sane human being would think was a violation of any reasonable rule. Saying something that injured the feelings of a fellow student or an administrator or a faculty member, demonstrating politically outside of a free speech zone. We had thought the whole campus was a free speech zone. Not true. They would segregate the people who had the audacity to want to, voice their sometimes unpopular views. They would put them in a little corner away from the center of the campus, and if they ventured outside of that little corner, they were charged with a form of trespassing, actually.
The free speech zone is a small triangle on campus. There's really no regular foot traffic.
When we measured the size of the free speech zone, it came out that it was only 0.1% of the entire land area of the main campus here.
We had suddenly had all of these phone calls and letters from students who were being charged with things which seemed to be normal life on a college campus, and so we couldn't handle it. There weren't enough lawyers around to handle it. So we started FIRE in order to process all these and try to, number one, find help for the students, and number two, we undertook the task of writing letters to the presidents and to the deans to explain why it is that this particular action could not be a violation. This particular action couldn't be a violation. If you have a rule against this, it's the rule that's the problem, not the student that's the problem. And I figured, you point out to an administrator how absurd the administrator is acting, surely the administrator will see the light of day. Well, no, not how the administrator reacted when we started to harangue them is they hired more assistants to deal with us.
So you're part of the reason why college is so bureaucratized and costs more money.
No, they have their own reasons for being bureaucratized, but I will admit that many campuses have a couple of bureaucrats who are tasked with dealing, if fire calls, how to deal
Putting
with
out
fire.
the fire.
Right. We knew that we were arriving at respectability when they started to teach how to deal with us.
In universities, there was this flourishing in post-war colleges as college became more mainstream and more mass, more people started going. There was a move to get rid of in loco parentis, the idea that you would go to college and the college would act in the place of the parents. And it was college was a place that, and this started in the late 60s, came fully online in the 70s, and then was ramped down or shut down in the 80s. But, college was a place where it was a free play zone, an autonomous zone for the students, and you could direct your own lives, you could direct your own education. That vanished. And then also you talk a lot about the effects or the influence of Herbert Marcuse's concept of repressive tolerance. Talk a little bit about why the end of In Loco Parentis seemed to be so brief, and then also how Marcuse is still kind of guiding a lot of activities.
Okay. The gradual almost disappearance of In Loco Parentis had another aspect to it that you didn't mention, but that is crucially important. At that period of time, the colleges opened up the admissions process, and you suddenly got on campuses that were basically, took for centuries or decades, took white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Suddenly, there were people of different religions and no religion. There were people of different races. There were people
different
of
genders.
Different genders.
And most of the elite schools were
single
sex
gender.
until the early 70s.
So suddenly you had coeducation, and you suddenly had all of these different students who were probably not living together in the neighborhoods where they grew up, which were much more segregated, who were suddenly living together on the same campus. Campus administrators made an assumption, fatal assumption, that without adequate supervision by adult bureaucrats, student life bureaucrats, these students would kill each other. And so they immediately ramped up the student life bureaucrats, and you know what bureaucrats love to do, they write rules, and suddenly the campuses were less free than they ever were. And my own view is that was the fatal mistake. Why? Because students actually get along fairly well if left alone. And I've seen it. I've dealt with students my entire legal career. They do get along. But when you've got bureaucrats who operate on the assumption that they're prepared to kill each other, and that sort of permeates everybody's thinking on the campus. And suddenly you have all these rules to keep students from assaulting each other, from embarrassing each other, from talking in an upsetting fashion to each other. This is on liberal arts campuses where you're supposed to talk in an upsetting fashions because you're trying to say things honestly rather than always sugarcoating them, right? That's the nature of, these are liberal arts institutions, searching for the truth. And so you had this bureaucracy working counter to the ethos of the liberal arts institution. And this started, they started to adopt speech codes. Suddenly, on a college campus, you couldn't say something that upset somebody. Literally, this was written into a code. And if you said something upsetting, the student can complain about it, and you were suddenly charged. What? So that's how we have a very big free speech component of our work. That's how it started.
When you look at college campuses now, 17 years later, why are they worse? What is driving it, and then what are the chances of pulling it back?
This is the dark side of accepting federal money. If you're running a university, the dark side is that 99-point-something% of these colleges are now dependent on these infusions of federal funds, and all the Office of Civil Rights has to do is say, if you don't hire 3 more bureaucrats in the Office of Sexual Assault Prevention, we are going to find you deficient in regard to dealing with sexual assault, and you're going to lose X millions, X tens of billions, X hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funds. Even though I doubt there's a college in the country that couldn't win a lawsuit very quickly if there was an attempt to take away their funds. They cave in instantly. No guts.
What changes positions in the Office of Civil Rights? Is it the bureaucrats there? Is it the president who appoints the Secretary of Education?
The bureaucracy has a life of its own, operates on a trajectory of its own. There's so many of them, it's even hard for the president to know who and what is in the bureaucracy and what they're doing at any given time. And occasionally there's a congressman who, usually somebody who has a kid in college and has heard some horror stories, you have a congressman who asks for a congressional investigation. That's how some of these things come to the surface. But essentially, the bureaucracy has a life of its own. It's self-governing, self-perpetuating. And in order to get rid of it, you have to kind of, the expression, pull it out root and branch. the office should be abolished. I simply have to say, it's not reformable. It's got a culture that is inimical to the whole concept of higher education, academic freedom, due process and fairness. They don't understand any of this, much less have any fidelity to it. The office should be abolished.